I was 42 when I learned that the most expensive thing in the world isn't love or loyalty or even a $1 billion biotech company. It's the cost of being underestimated by a man who thinks money makes him invincible. And I learned it because my husband tried to kill me rather than pay for his freedom. My name is Vivienne. I'm a lawyer turned philanthropist in New York City. I spent my early career protecting intellectual property, defending ideas that people had stolen, proving that creation had value even when thieves tried to claim it as their own. I was good at it. I was precise. I was patient. What I didn't know was that all those skills were preparation for the case of my life, a case where I was both the evidence and the verdict, the victim and the prosecutor, the woman who almost died and the architect of her husband's destruction. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, this is where we talk about the marriages that look like empires and the divorces that become wars. Subscribe if you've ever been worth more to someone dead than alive. Hit the bell. The next story might be your insurance policy. Here's my story. I met Harrison Cross at a legal conference in Davos. I was 32, successful but not wealthy, respected but not known. He was 45, the founder of Cross Biotech, valued at $4 billion, widowed, with a teenage daughter named Emma, who looked at the world with the practiced boredom of someone who had already seen everything money could buy. Harrison was handsome in the way that power makes people handsome, not because of features, but because of certainty. He knew he was important. He knew you knew. And he moved through rooms with the assumption that his presence was a gift he bestowed, that his attention was currency, that his interest in you was an investment you should be grateful to receive. He was interested in me. Not immediately. Harrison didn't do immediate. He observed first, calculated, determined value before committing resources. He watched me argue a panel on pharmaceutical patent law, watched me dismantle a corporate lawyer twice my age with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for every counterargument. Afterward, he approached with a glass of wine he hadn't asked if I wanted. "You're wasted in defense," he said. "Not a compliment, an assessment. You should be building something, creating value instead of protecting it." "I create value by ensuring creators get paid," I said. "Without people like me, people like you have nothing to steal." He laughed. It was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him, and it surprised us both. "Steal is such an ugly word. I prefer leverage existing frameworks." "And I prefer theft," I said. "But we can agree to disagree." We didn't disagree for long. Harrison pursued me the way he pursued acquisitions, thoroughly, expensively, with the absolute conviction that what he wanted would eventually be his. He sent flowers to my office, invitations to events I couldn't afford, introductions to people whose names appeared in newspapers I didn't read. He was relentless without being desperate, attentive without being present, generous without being personal. I was cautious. I had seen men like Harrison before, men who collected women the way they collected art, as investments that appreciated in public value. But I was also 32, tired of dating men who were intimidated by my intelligence, and secretly fascinated by someone who wasn't threatened by anything. He proposed 6 months later. A ring that cost more than my apartment, in a restaurant where the wine list required a financial advisor. I said yes, not because I loved him, I'm still not sure what I felt was love exactly, but because I believed I could build something real inside the performance he required. Because I saw Emma, his daughter, and thought I could be the mother she didn't have. Because I was ambitious in ways I hadn't admitted to myself, and Harrison represented the summit of a mountain I hadn't known I wanted to climb. We married in a wedding that cost $2 million. Vogue covered it. The prenuptial agreement I negotiated myself gave me $50 million in a divorce, a fraction of his fortune, but enough for independence. Harrison didn't worry. Men like him don't plan for divorce, they plan for replacement. I should have noticed that distinction. I didn't, not then. The first years were performance. I played the role Harrison needed: hostess, partner, legal advisor he could trust but never acknowledge publicly. I organized galas for his foundation, managed relationships with investors, navigated the social requirements of being Mrs. Harrison Cross. I was good at it. I had always been good at making other people look good. I was also good with Emma. She was 15 when I married Harrison, angry and guarded and desperate for someone who wouldn't leave. Her mother had died of an overdose when Emma was 8, not the polished story Harrison told about a tragic illness, but the truth I found in medical records, in whispered conversations with staff, in the way Emma flinched at the smell of alcohol. I didn't try to replace her mother, I simply showed up. I attended her school events, listened to her music, helped her apply to colleges without Harrison's intervention. I became someone she could trust, which was more than she had from her father. Leo was born when I'd been married 4 years. Harrison wanted a son, an heir, a continuation, proof of his virility and legacy. I wanted a child, not for Harrison, for myself, for the possibility of building something that wasn't performance, that wasn't negotiation, that simply was. Harrison was present at the birth, photographed for press releases, then absent for the first 6 weeks while he managed a crisis in Singapore. I didn't mind. I had Emma. I had Leo. I had the beginning of something that felt like family, even if the foundation was cracked. The cracks widened gradually. Harrison's absences increased. His attention, never generous, became transactional, present when needed for image, absent when not. He mentioned friends I never met, meetings that didn't appear on his calendar, conferences in locations where no conferences were scheduled. I didn't investigate, not at first. I told myself that marriage required trust, that suspicion was poison, that Harrison's privacy was his right. But I was a lawyer. I had built my career on noticing inconsistencies, on following paper trails, on trusting documentation over denial. The documentation was clear. Harrison had a lover, an executive at Cross Biotech, 30 years old, ambitious, willing to ignore what I couldn't. Her name was Sasha. She had been promoted twice in 18 months, given responsibilities she hadn't earned, photographed with Harrison at events where I was notably absent. I confronted him, not with anger. Harrison didn't respond to anger, with evidence, with the calm precision I used in court. "You're having an affair," I said. "I don't care about the infidelity, I care about the incompetence. Sasha is mishandling the European patent applications. If this becomes public, the stock drops, the board panics, and your carefully constructed image becomes tabloid fodder." Harrison looked at me with something that might have been respect. "You always were practical," he said. "Most women would cry, scream, threaten. I'm not most women," I said. "I'm your wife, and I'm telling you to end it cleanly, professionally, before it damages what we've built." He agreed, or he said he did. He ended the affair publicly, transferred Sasha to a subsidiary, maintained the image of a chastened husband returning to his family. I accepted the performance. I had invested too much to dismantle it without cause. But Harrison had invested too, and his investment had a different return. The prenuptial agreement became a problem. $50 million was money Harrison could afford but didn't want to pay. Especially now, with Sasha whispering about making things official, about the life they could have, about the wife who was practical but not passionate. Divorce would cost him half his liquid assets, public embarrassment, and the risk that I would use what I knew about Sasha, about the company, about the carefully constructed facade in negotiations. Harrison didn't discuss divorce, he discussed my health. I had Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, a minor cardiac condition diagnosed at 16. An extra electrical pathway in my heart, managed with medication, monitored annually, never dangerous. I had disclosed it before marriage, included it in every insurance form, mentioned it casually as the kind of detail that made me human rather than perfect. Harrison began to worry about it. Publicly, affectionately, the concerned husband who researched treatments, found specialists, wanted the best for his wife. He brought me articles about new medications, arranged appointments with cardiologists he selected, suggested upgrades to my management plan. "I'm fine," I told him repeatedly. "It's controlled, it's been controlled for 20 years. "But it could be better," he said. "You're young, you have Leo. You have so much life ahead, I want to make sure you're here for all of it." His concern seemed genuine. I wanted to believe it was. I wanted to believe that the man who had pursued me, who had married me, who had fathered my child, still contained something beyond calculation. I was 39. I had spent 7 years in this marriage. I had built a family, a reputation, a life that looked like success. I didn't want to dismantle it over suspicion, so I accepted the new medication. The improved formulation that Harrison had sourced through industry contacts. The pills that looked slightly different from my previous prescription, that he explained as a newer version, not yet widely available but clinically superior. I took them for 3 months. I felt fine. Better than fine. Harrison was attentive, present, affectionate in ways he hadn't been since our engagement. He brought me breakfast in bed. He canceled trips to stay home. He photographed us together for social media, the happy family, the devoted husband caring for his wife. I should have been suspicious. The attention was too complete, too performative, too perfectly timed. But I was human. I was tired. I wanted to believe that crisis had brought us closer, that my health scare had reminded him of what mattered, that our marriage could still become what I had hoped. I was wrong. The medication was digoxin, a cardiac drug that, in therapeutic doses, helps arrhythmia. In toxic doses, it causes fatal arrhythmia. Harrison had been gradually increasing my dose, monitoring my response, calculating the level that would appear natural, that would kill me without leaving evidence of murder. The night I collapsed, I was alone. Harrison was at a conference, actually with Sasha, rekindling their affair now that his plan was in motion. I was FaceTiming with my sister, Isabel, complaining about the heartburn I'd had all day, the nausea, the strange fatigue that had been building for weeks. "Vivienne," Isabel said, her face on the screen suddenly sharp. "You look gray, are you okay?" I started. Then the pain hit, the crushing pressure in my chest, the arrhythmia that felt like my heart was trying to escape my body. I dropped the phone. I heard Isabel screaming my name. I felt my body convulse, my vision narrow, the world reduced to a tunnel that ended in darkness. I woke in the hospital, 3 days later. Harrison was beside my bed, the concerned husband, the grieving almost widow who had rushed back from his conference to be present. He held my hand. He told me how scared he'd been. He told me the doctors had found dangerous levels of digoxin in my blood, that they were investigating, that he was so grateful I was alive. I looked at him. I saw the calculation behind the concern, the assessment of whether I would survive, whether the plan had failed, whether he needed to adjust. I saw the man who had tried to kill me, sitting beside my bed, holding my hand, telling me he loved me. I smiled. I thanked him. I told him I was tired, that I needed to rest, that I was so grateful he was here. And I began to plan. I was a lawyer. I was a survivor. I was a woman who had built her career on proving that thieves don't get to keep what they steal. And Harrison had tried to steal my life. I didn't go to the police. Not immediately. Harrison had resources, lawyers, investigators, influence that could bury a direct accusation under years of litigation and counter-accusations. I needed something else. I needed a case so solid that his money couldn't break it, so public that his reputation couldn't survive it, so complete that his only option was surrender. I played the role he expected. Grateful wife, recovering patient, dependent on the husband who had saved her. I let him manage my medication, back to the legitimate prescription, the safe dose, the treatment that kept me stable. I let him photograph us together, post about my recovery, build the narrative of devoted husband and lucky wife. Meanwhile, I investigated. I saved samples of the improved medication in a safety deposit box. I documented every doctor's visit, every prescription change, every conversation where Harrison mentioned my health. I hired a private investigator, through a shell company, untraceable to me, to follow Harrison and Sasha, to document their affair, to establish the motive that Harrison thought he'd hidden. And I investigated cross-biotech. Not as wife. As lawyer. As someone who understood that Harrison's willingness to kill me suggested a willingness to commit other crimes, other frauds, other destructions that I could use to build my case. What I found was worse than I expected. Harrison had been falsifying clinical trial data for Cross-Biotech's flagship product, an Alzheimer's treatment that was supposed to revolutionize the industry. The drug didn't work, or it worked marginally, in ways that didn't justify the investment. The stock price, the hopes of thousands of patients and millions of shareholders. Harrison had directed researchers to alter results, to exclude negative outcomes, to present data that suggested efficacy where none existed. Thousands of patients had enrolled in trials based on false hope. Millions of dollars in investments had been made based on lies. And Harrison had known, had directed, had profited. I documented everything. Patient records, researcher emails, financial statements that showed Harrison selling stock before negative news became public. I built a case that wasn't just about my attempted murder. It was about the destruction of strangers, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the systematic betrayal of trust that Harrison had built his empire upon. But I needed more. I needed the final piece that would make this undeniable, that would strip Harrison of the protection that money and reputation provided. I contacted Sash. I didn't approach her as the wronged wife. That would have been predictable, emotional, easily dismissed. I approached her as a consultant with information that affected her future. "Sasha," I said, We met in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan, far from anyone who might recognize us. I'm not here about your affair with my husband. I'm here about your future, which is about to be destroyed. She was young, beautiful, ambitious in the hungry way that Harrison had always attracted. She looked at me with the defensive wariness of someone who had been the other woman, who had learned to expect confrontation rather than conversation. I don't know what you're smart, I interrupted. You wouldn't be where you are if you weren't, so listen carefully. Harrison is falsifying clinical trial data. I have proof. And when this becomes public, which it will, because I'm making it public, everyone associated with him will be contaminated, including you, your career, your reputation, your ability to ever work in this industry again. She paled. I watched her calculate the same calculation Harrison performed constantly, the assessment of value and risk and survival. Why are you telling me this? Because I have a proposal. Cooperate with me. Provide evidence of Harrison's discussions about resolving our marriage, about my health, about the digoxin. In exchange, I ensure that your role in the affair is presented as manipulation by a senior executive, not conspiracy. You keep your career, you keep your future, you just lose Harrison. And if I refuse, then you go down with him, as co-conspirator, as accomplice, as the woman who helped a murderer try to kill his wife. She didn't refuse. Sasha provided emails, recordings, documentation of conversations where Harrison discussed my cardiac issues as convenient, where he calculated the cost of divorce versus the cost of widowhood, where he joked about "till death do us part" with the confidence of someone who planned to control the timing. I had everything, but I didn't go to the authorities yet. I needed one more thing. I needed Harrison to believe he had won. I created the Leo Cross Foundation, named for my son, dedicated to ethics in medical research, funded with my own money and the donations of people who believed in my reputation, my story, my commitment to transparency. I organized a gala, the kind of event Harrison had taught me to stage, with celebrities and politicians and journalists who covered the intersection of medicine and money. At the gala, I gave a speech. Not about Harrison. About integrity. About the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry to patients, to truth, to the lives that depended on honest research. I announced that the foundation had discovered concerning irregularities in clinical trial practices and was committed to exposing them. I didn't name Cross Biotech. I didn't need to. The journalists in the room made the connections. The investors made calculations. The regulators made phone calls. Harrison panicked. He tried to contain the damage, to spin the narrative, to present himself as the victim of a smear campaign by a disgruntled wife. But I had prepared too well. The evidence was too complete. The story was too public, and then the final move. I filed a police report, not as victim, as citizen. I had discovered, during my recovery, evidence that my husband had attempted to poison me. I had medical records, toxicology reports, the testimony of my sister who had witnessed my collapse, the documentation of the medication Harrison had provided. I presented it calmly, professionally, as someone who had almost died and wanted to ensure no one else faced the same danger. The arrest was public. Harrison, at the airport, boarding a private jet with passports and accounts that would have carried him to a life without extradition. The FBI had been watching, not because of me directly, but because the public exposure of Cross Biotech's fraud had triggered investigations that revealed his flight plans, his assets, his preparations for escape. He was charged with attempted murder, securities fraud, conspiracy. The trial was fast, the evidence overwhelming, the publicity inescapable. Harrison Cross, billionaire, philanthropist, husband, father, became Harrison Cross, defendant, fraud, would-be killer. I testified, not with anger, with precision, with the calm documentation of facts that had made me a successful lawyer, that had kept me alive, that would now keep him in prison. I described the medication, the doses, the collapse. I described the affair, the motive, the calculation that had valued my life at less than $50 million. Harrison was convicted, sentenced to life without parole. His assets frozen, then confiscated. Cross Biotech dissolved, its executives prosecuted, its fraudulent drug removed from trials that had given false hope to dying patients. I inherited everything, not because I wanted it, because as his legal wife, with him alive but imprisoned, the assets became mine to manage, to dispose of, to transform into something that wasn't built on fraud and murder. I sold it all. The company, the properties, the investments. I liquidated Harrison's empire and poured the proceeds into the Leo Cross Foundation. I created compensation programs for families harmed by the fraudulent trials. I established research grants for ethical medical innovation. I became the advocate that Harrison had pretended to be, the voice for patients that he had exploited. And I raised my children. Emma, who had learned that the father she feared was worse than she imagined, who became a law student determined to protect others from what she had survived. Leo, who would never remember the father who tried to kill his mother, who would grow up knowing only the foundation that bore his name and the mother who had built it from destruction. I visited Harrison once. 1 year after the conviction, in the maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his life. He was smaller. The power that had made him handsome had drained away, leaving a man who looked his age, who looked defeated, who looked at me with the confusion of someone who still couldn't understand how he had lost. "Why?" he asked, not angry, just exhausted. "You had everything, you had me, you had the life I built, why destroy it?" I sat across from him, separated by glass, connected by a history that only one of us had survived intact. "I didn't destroy anything," I said. "You tried to kill me because you didn't want to pay for divorce. You falsified medical data because you didn't want to admit failure. You built an empire on lies because the truth wasn't profitable enough. I simply documented your choices. I simply made them visible." "You could have come to me," he said. "We could have worked something out. The marriage, the company, everything, we were partners." "We were never partners," I said. "You were the buyer, I was the acquisition. And when the acquisition became too expensive, you decided to liquidate it. You just didn't expect the acquisition to fight back." I showed him photographs. Not of me, of Emma, graduating from college, beginning law school, building a life from the wreckage of his betrayal. Of Leo, 7 years old, smiling at the opening of a research center that would help children his age survive diseases that Harrison's fraud had pretended to cure. Of Sasha, who had rebuilt her career, who had testified against him, who had survived his manipulation to become something he hadn't destroyed. "I killed them all," Harrison said, not a confession, a statement of fact, the way he might have described a business decision. "You, the company, myself." "No," I said. "You chose to poison your wife instead of divorcing her. You chose to falsify data instead of creating real medicine. You chose to be the kind of man who destroys rather than builds. I simply made your choices visible. I simply ensured that you couldn't hide them anymore." I stood. I adjusted my coat. I looked at him for the last time, the man who had tried to kill me, who had been my husband, who had fathered my son. "Leo asks about you," I said. "I tell him you're in a place where people go when they do very bad things, but that he can still write to you, if you write back, if you have something to say that isn't an excuse." Harrison didn't respond. I didn't wait for him to. I walked out of the prison, into sunlight that felt like the first I'd seen in years, even though I'd been living in it all along. Every year, on the anniversary of my collapse, the day Harrison tried to kill me, the day I almost died, the day my real life began, I host a dinner. Not a celebration. A remembrance. I invite survivors of medical fraud, families who lost loved ones to false hope, people who learned that the systems designed to protect them were operated by those who would destroy them for profit. At the head of the table, an empty chair. For Harrison, for the men who believe money buys impunity, for the ghosts I don't let die, because remembering them is remembering that I survived. My children are there. Emma, now a lawyer, fighting the kind of cases I used to handle. Leo, growing into someone who understands that his name represents not his father, but his mother's survival. They sit beside me, real and present and alive, the family I built from the ruins of what Harrison tried to destroy. I'm Vivienne. I'm 42 years old. I'm a survivor, a philanthropist, a woman who was worth more dead than alive and proved her husband wrong by becoming worth more than he ever imagined. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought money made them invincible, if you've ever had to build justice from the wreckage of betrayal, this one's for you. See you in the next story.